Hello, and welcome back to Afjer Audiobooks. Today, I'll be reading one of my all-time favorite series, starting with Book 1. This is Ranger's Apprentice, Book 1, The Ruins of Gorlan by John Flanagan. All credit goes to the author, John Flanagan. If you want to read more from John Flanagan, his name is spelled Johnflanagan, also shown on the screen. Trust me when I say that he is a fantastic author. Before we begin, keep in mind that I have little access to editing software and very little experience with editing, so this will definitely not be the best audiobook you've ever heard. I also sometimes stumble over words. Let us begin. Chapter 14. We'll come around a little, said Holt. Will glanced back at the shaggy pony, who watched him with intelligent eyes. Come on, boy, he said, and pulled on the halter. Instantly, Tug braced his forelegs and refused to move. Will pulled harder on the rope, leaning back in his efforts and to make the stubborn little pony move. Old Bob cackled with laughter. "He be stronger than you," he said. Will felt his ears reddening with embarrassment. He pulled harder. Tug twitched his ears and resisted. It was like trying to pull a house along. "Don't look at him," Will said softly. "Just take the rope and walk away from him. He'll follow." Will tried it that way. He turned his back on Tug, seized the rope firmly, and began walking. The pony trotted easily after him. Will looked at Holt and grinned. Ranger nodded his head toward the far fence of the paddock. Will glanced across and saw a small saddle placed across the top rail of the fence. "Saddle him up," said the ranger. Tug clip-clopped docilely across the fence. Will looped the reins around the fence rail and hefted the saddle across the pony's back. He bent down to fasten the girth straps on the saddle. Pull them good and tight, Old Bob advised him. Finally, the saddle was firmly in position. Will looked eagerly at Holt. "Can I ride him now?" he asked. Ranger stroked his uneven beard thoughtfully before he answered. "If you feel that's a good idea, go ahead," he said finally. Will hesitated for a moment. The phrase stirred a vague memory with him. But then eagerness overcame caution, and he put one foot in the stirrup and swung himself nimbly onto the pony's back. Tug stood, unmoving. "Get up," Will said, drumming his heels against the pony's side. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Will felt a small tremor of movement through the pony's body. Suddenly, Tug arched his muscular little back and shot straight into the air, all 4 feet leaving the ground at the same time. He twisted violently to one side, came down on his front legs, and kicked his rear legs high into the sky. Will sailed neatly over the pony's ears, turned a complete somersault in the air, and crashed on his back in the dirt. He picked himself up, rubbing his back. Tug stood nearby, ears up, watching him intently. "Now why did you go and do a silly thing like that?" the eyes seemed to say. Old Bob leaned against the fence, sides heaving with laughter. Will looked at Holt. "What did I do wrong?" he asked. Holt ducked into the fence rails and walked across to where Tug stood watching the two of them expectantly. He handed the bridle back to Will, then laid one hand on his shoulder. "Nothing if this were an ordinary horse," he said, "but Tug has been trained as a ranger horse." "What's the difference?" Will interrupted angrily, and held his hand up for silence. "Difference is, each ranger horse has to be asked before the rider mounts them for the first time," said Holt. "They're trained that way so they can never be stolen." Will scratched his head. "I'd never heard of such a thing," he said. Old Bob smiled as he walked forward. "Not too many folks have," he said. "That's why ranger horses never get stolen." "Well," said Will, "what do you say to a ranger horse before you mount him?" Holt shrugged. "It varies from horse to horse. Each one responds to a different request." He gestured toward the larger horse. "My horse, for example, responds to the words, 'Permettez moi.'" "Permettez moi?" Will echoed. "What sort of words are they?" "They're Gaelic. They mean, 'Will you allow me?' His parents came from Gallagher, you see." Holt explained. Then he turned to old Bob. "What are the words for Tug here, Bob?" Bob screwed up his eyes, pretending that he couldn't remember. Then his face cleared. "Ah, yes, I recall," he said. "This on here, he needs to be asked, 'Do you mind?' before you get on his back." "Do you mind?" Will repeated, and Bob shook his head. "Don't say it to me, youngster. Say it to the horse's ear." Being a little silly, and not at all sure what the others were having a joke at his expense, Will stepped forward and said softly in Tug's ear, "Do you mind?" Tug I can't tell if that's whinnied or whined. Whinnied softly. Will looked doubtfully at the two men, and Bob nodded encouragement. Go on. Climb on now. Young Tug won't harm you now. Very carefully, Will swung himself onto the pony's shaggy back once again. His back still ached from the previous attempt. He sat there a moment. Nothing happened. Then he tapped his heels gently against Tug's ribs. Come on, boy, he said softly. Tug's ears twitched up, and he stepped forward at an easy walk. Still cautious, Will let him walk around the paddock once or twice, then tapped against his heels. Tug broke into a gentle trot. Will moved easily to the rhythm of the horse's movement, and Halt looked on approvingly. The boy was an instinctive rider. The ranger unclipped the short length of the rope that held the paddock gate closed, and swung the wide gate open. Take him out, Will, he said, and see what he can really do. Obediently, Will turned the pony toward the gate, and as they passed through into the open ground beyond, tapped once more with his heels. He felt the muscular little body beneath him bunch momentarily. Then Tug broke into a fast gallop. The wind rushed past Will's ears as he leaned forward over the pony's neck, encouraging him to even greater speed. Tug's ears pricked upward in response, and he went even faster than before. He was like the wind. His short legs were a blur of motion as he carried the boy at full speed toward the edge of the trees. Gently, not sure how the pony would react, Will applied pressure to the left-hand rein. Instantly, Tug veered to the left, racing away from the trees at an angle. Will kept the gentle pressure on the rein until Tug was headed once again back toward the paddock. Will gasped in amazement as he saw how far they had come. Halt and old Bob were tiny figures in the distance now, but they grew rapidly larger as Tug flew over the rough grass toward them. A fallen log loomed in front of them, and before Will could make an effort to avoid it, Tug gathered himself, steadied, and leaped over the obstacle. Will let out a shout of excitement, and the pony whinnied briefly in reply. They rushed back to the paddock now, and Will pulled gently on both reins. Instantly, Tug slowed to a canter, then a trot, finally coming down to a walking pace as Will maintained the pressure on the reins. He brought the pony to a standstill beside Halt. Tug tossed his shaggy head and whinnied again. Will leaned forward and patted the pony on the neck. He's terrific, he said breathlessly. He's as fast as the wind. Halt nodded gravely. Perhaps not as fast as the winds, he said, but he can certainly cover ground. He turned to the old man. You've done well with him, Bob. Old Bob ducked his head in appreciation and leaned forward to pat the shaggy little pony in his turn. He'd spent his life breeding and training and preparing the Ranger Corps horses, and this one ranked among the best he'd seen. You'll keep that pace all day, he said fondly. Run them fat battle horses into the ground, this one will. Youngster rides him well, too, Ranger, don't he? Hot stroked his beard. Not too badly, he said. Bob was scandalized. Not too badly. You're a hard man, Ranger. Youngster sat him light as a feather through that jump. The old man looked up at Will, sitting astride the pony, and nodded in appreciation. You don't saw away at them reins like some do, neither. But a light touch with a horse's soft mouth, yes. Will grinned at the old horse trainer's praise. He sneaked a quick look at Halt, but the Ranger was as grave-faced as ever. He never smiles, Will thought to himself. He went to dismount, then stopped himself hurriedly. Is there anything I should do before I get off him? Bob laughed again. No, youngster. Once said, and young Tug here will remember. As long as it's you who's riding him. Relieved, Will climbed down. He stood beside the pony, and Tug shoved him affectionately with his head. Will glanced at the apple barrel. Could I give him another? He asked. Halt nodded. Just one more, he said. But don't go making a habit of it. He'll be too fat to run if you feed him all the time. Tug snorted loudly. Apparently he and Halt were at odds over how many apples a pony should have in a day. Will spent the rest of the day getting tips on riding technique from old Bob and learning how to look after and repair Tug's saddle and harness, as well as the finer points of caring for the little horse. He brushed and curried the shaggy coat until it shone. Tug seemed to appreciate his efforts. Finally, worn out, his arms aching with the effort, he had slumped into a seat on a hay bale, which, of course, had to be the exact moment when Halt walked into the stable. Come along, he said. No time to be lolling around doing nothing. We'd best get moving if we're going to be home before dark. And so saying, he tossed his saddle across the back of his horse. Will didn't bother to protest that he had been lolling around, as the ranger put it. For moments, he knew for a start, he knew that it would be no use, and secondly, he was excited by the fact that he would be riding back to Halt's little cottage by the edge of the forest. It seemed that the two horses were to become a permanent part of their establishment. He realized now that Halt's horse had obviously been so before, and that the ranger had only been waiting till Will had shown his ability to ride and to bond with Tug before reclaiming him from his temporary home in old Bob's stable. The horses whinnied to each other from time to time as they trotted back through the dim green forest, for all the world as if they were carrying on their own conversation. Will was bursting with questions he wanted to ask, but by now he was wary of chattering too much in the ranger's presence. Finally, he could contain himself no longer. "Halt," he said experimentally. The ranger grunted. Will took that as a sign he could continue speaking. "What's your horse's name?" the boy asked. Hall looked at him and said. His horse was slightly larger than Tug, although nowhere near the size of the giant battle horses kept in the Baird's stable. "I believe it's Abelard," he said. "Abelard?" Will repeated. "What kind of name is that?" "It's Gaelic," said the ranger, obviously putting an end to the conversation. They rode a few kilometers farther in silence. The sun was lowering over the trees now, and their shadows were long and distorted on the ground in front of them. Will studied Tug's shadow. The pony seemed to have enormously long legs and a ridiculously short body. He wanted to call Halt's attention to it, but such frivolous observation would not impress the ranger. Instead, he summoned the courage to ask another question that had been occupying his thoughts for some days. "Halt," he said again. The ranger sighed briefly. "What now?" he asked. His tone definitely did not encourage further conversation. However, Will pressed on. "Remember you told me how a ranger was responsible for Morgorath's defeat?" Holt grunted. "Well, I was just wondering, what was the ranger's name?" the boy asked. "Names aren't important," Will said. "I really can't remember." "Was it you?" Will continued. "Sure that it was." Holt turned that level, unsmiling gaze on him again. "I said names aren't important," he repeated. There was a silence between them for some seconds. Then the ranger said, "Do you know what is important?" Will shook his head. "Supper is important," said the ranger, "and we'll be late for it if we don't hurry." He clapped his heels into Abelard's side, and the horse shot away like an arrow from Halt's own bow, leaving Will and Tug far behind in a matter of seconds. Will touched Tug's side with his own heels, and the little pony raced off in pursuit of his bigger friend. "Come on, Tug," Will urged. "Let's show them how a real ranger horse can run." And that is the end of the chapter. Thank you so much for listening. I think I might be having an allergic reaction. I will see you in the next reading. Bye.